In the tranquil English village of Willowbrook, where nothing ever seems to disturb the peace, a beautiful antique Swiss music box, a cherished gift from a dead husband, begins to play its haunting melody of the Blue Danube. Alone in the dead of night, drifting across the darkness from a silent manor house with no lights burning. Visiting elderly sleuth Miss Marple hears the eerie tune and senses something sinister beneath the village's calm facade. Soon, a bizarre burglary occurs where nothing is stolen except the music box is mysteriously opened, followed by the shocking suicide of the manor's nervous companion. As whispers spread and danger lurks behind polite smiles, Miss Marple unravels a deadly web of greed. The innocent-looking box hides smuggled jewels worth a fortune, and a desperate murderer has staged everything including cold-blooded killing to cover her tracks. What seems like a harmless curiosity becomes a chilling tale of deception and death, until one sharp-minded old lady exposes the truth. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Willowbrook. The train drew into Willowbrook station with a gentle hiss of steam, and Miss Jane Marple alighted with her usual composure, carrying her small suitcase in one hand and her umbrella in the other. It was a fine autumn afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the village chimneys. Willowbrook lay peacefully in its little valley, a cluster of gray stone cottages huddled around the ancient church with its square Norman tower, and beyond them the green, where a few ducks quacked contentedly beside the pond. The hills rose gently on either side, clothed in fading bracken, and the whole scene had that peculiarly English charm which Miss Marple always found so restorative. She had come at the urgent invitation of her old friend, Mrs. Bantry Dolly Bantry, as she still thought of her, who had moved to Willowbrook some years earlier after selling the old family place. The Laurels, Mrs. Bantry's new home, was a pleasant, medium-sized house standing in its own grounds, a little way back from the high street, with a neat garden and a view over the churchyard. A porter touched his cap respectfully and took Miss Marple's suitcase. "Taxi for the Laurels, miss?" he inquired. "No, thank you," said Miss Marple. "I prefer to walk." "It is not far," and indeed it was not. She proceeded at a gentle pace along the winding lane, pausing now and then to admire a particularly fine display of Michaelmas daisies in a cottage garden, or to exchange a polite greeting with a passer-by. Villages, she reflected, were all very much alike in essentials, though each had its own individual character. Willowbrook struck her as peaceful and prosperous, with none of the sharper contrasts one sometimes found elsewhere. Mrs. Bantry was waiting at the gate, a plump, good-humored woman with untidy gray hair and bright eyes. "Jane, my dear, how wonderful to see you. You look exactly the same, not a day older. Come in, come in. Tea is all ready." She led the way into the house, chattering as she went. "I've put you in the blue room. It has the best view. And I've so much to tell you. We've quite a little society here now. There's young Dr. Haydock. He's taken over old Dr. Matthews's practice and is very capable, though a little abrupt in manner. Then the Harrisons at the Grange Rather County, you know, but pleasant enough. And Mrs. Dane Covington at the Manor. She bought it last year after poor Mr. Dane Covington died. Quite a handsome woman, and very well off, they say. The tea was excellent thin bread and butter, scones with Devonshire cream, and a rich fruit cake. Mrs. Bantry poured out with a lavish hand. "You must rest this evening," she said, "but tomorrow I'll take you round and introduce you properly. Everyone is dying to meet you. They've heard so much about my clever friend, who knows all about crimes and things." Miss Marple smiled and deprecated with a little shake of her head. "My dear Dolly, you exaggerate. I only know about human nature, and that, after all, is much the same everywhere." "Human nature!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry. "That's just it. In a village like this, one sees it at its best and its worst. There's no hiding anything here. The postmistress knows everyone's business, and Miss Hartnell, at the district nurse's cottage, is a positive ferret for news. Not that there's ever anything very exciting, thank goodness. Just the usual little squabbles and romances. She leaned forward confidentially. Though there is one thing rather odd. Mrs. Dane Covington, you'll meet her soon, has this beautiful Swiss music box. Her husband brought it back from Geneva shortly before he died suddenly. It's a lovely thing, plays the Blue Danube most charmingly. But she keeps it locked away and hardly ever touches it now. Says it reminds her too much of him. Rather sad, isn't it? Miss Marple murmured agreement. Sad indeed, she thought, but memories were curious things. Sometimes one clung to them, sometimes one fled from them. After tea, Mrs. Bantry insisted on showing her friend the garden. The laurels stood next door to the manor grounds, separated only by a tall yew hedge with a gate in it for neighborly convenience. Through a gap in the foliage they could glimpse the manor itself, an imposing Queen Anne house with graceful chimneys and mullioned windows. Mrs. Dane Covington lives there quite alone, said Mrs. Bantry, except for her companion, Miss Faraday, a quiet little woman, very devoted, I believe, in the servants. She entertains very little. Prefers her own company, or so she says. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. People who preferred their own company often had reasons for it, reasons that might, or might not, bear looking into. But aloud she only said mildly, what a charming prospect, and how peaceful it all seems. That evening, after an excellent dinner and a comfortable chat by the fire, Miss Marple retired early to her room. She unpacked with methodical care, arranging her few possessions neatly, and then sat by the window in the fading light, looking out over the quiet village. Willowbrook, she decided, was indeed a pleasant spot. One could imagine nothing ever disturbing its tranquility. Yet even as the thought passed through her mind, Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, rather whimsical smile. Human nature being what it was, tranquility was often deceptive. And in her experience, villages quiet, seemingly innocent villages, held secrets as dark as any to be found in the great cities. But for the moment, all was peace. The church clock struck 9, and soon the lights in the cottages began to go out one by one. Miss Marple drew her curtains, said her prayers, and settled down for what she fully expected would be an undisturbed night's rest. She little knew how soon that expectation was to be shattered. Chapter 2. The Gift. 3 days after her arrival in Willowbrook, Miss Jane Marple found herself accompanying Mrs. Bantry on a short walk up the gravelled drive that led to the manor. Morning had been showery, but by afternoon the clouds had lifted, leaving the air fresh and the garden borders sparkling with raindrops on late roses and Michaelmas daisies. Mrs. Bantry, in a stout tweed coat and sensible brogues, carried a small bunch of chrysanthemums as a neighborly offering. I thought we might call on Mrs. Dane Covington, she explained as they walked. She has been rather low lately, and a little company does no harm. Besides, I want you to see the house. It is quite the finest in the neighborhood, Queen Anne, with some very good pieces inside. Poor Mr. Dane Covington collected antiques, and his widow has kept everything exactly as it was. Miss Marple, neatly gloved and hatted, nodded with interest. She had already formed a mental picture of Mrs. Dane Covington from Mrs. Bantry's descriptions. A handsome woman in her late 50s, recently bereaved, living quietly with a paid companion and a reduced staff. Such households, Miss Marple reflected, often concealed more than they revealed. The manor stood back from the drive behind a screen of yews, its red brick mellowed by time, its tall chimneys rising gracefully against the sky. A manservant admitted them and showed them into a small anteroom while he carried Mrs. Bantry's card upstairs. Presently he returned to say that Mrs. Dane Covington would be pleased to receive them in the drawing-room. They ascended a wide oak staircase and were ushered into a long, beautifully proportioned room overlooking the south lawn. The furniture was of the best period Chippendale chairs, a fine Sheraton sideboard, and a walnut bureau of exquisite workmanship. On the walls hung several good portraits, including one of a gentleman in the uniform of the early 19th century, and a more recent oil painting of a man in his 60s with a strong, rather florid face. Mr. Dane Covington, no doubt. Their hostess rose to greet them. Mrs. Dane Covington was indeed a striking figure, tall, with well-marked features, abundant iron-gray hair, dressed in a fashionable wave, and dark eyes that held a hint of melancholy. She wore a simple black afternoon dress, relieved only by a single row of pearls, and her manner combined dignity with a certain restrained warmth. "My dear Mrs. Bantry," she said, extending a hand, "how kind of you to call. And this, I think, is Miss Marple, of whom I have heard so much." Introductions were performed, and the three ladies seated themselves near the fire, for though the day was fine, the room was large and a little chilly. Tea was brought in on a silver tray, thin bread and butter, hot scones, and a Dundee cake of excellent quality. Conversation began on the usual topics: the weather, the garden, the difficulty of getting reliable servants nowadays. Mrs. Dane Covington spoke with composure, but Miss Marple, whose mild blue eyes missed very little, noticed that her hands were not quite steady as she poured the tea, and that, from time to time, her gaze strayed towards the mantelpiece. It was a handsome marble mantelpiece, and upon it, in the place of honor, stood a small object that immediately attracted Miss Marple's attention. It was a music box of Swiss manufacture, about 8 inches long, exquisitely carved in walnut, with inlaid panels of lighter wood, depicting alpine scenes, mountains, chalets, and edelweiss. The craftsmanship was of the finest quality, and even from her chair Miss Marple could see the delicate brass key at the side. Mrs. Dane Covington, observing the direction of her guest's glance, smiled faintly. "You are admiring my little music box, Miss Marple? It is rather beautiful, is it not? My husband brought it back from Geneva only a few weeks before his death. He had a fancy for such things, mechanical toys, curiosities, anything that combined ingenuity with beauty." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Do let us hear it play, my dear." "I have only heard it once, and that was ages ago." Their hostess hesitated for a moment, then rose and crossed to the mantelpiece. She took the box down with careful hands, as though it were something fragile and precious. "It plays the Blue Danube," she said quietly. "A charming little waltz Strauss, of course." She inserted the key, gave it several turns, and lifted the lid. At once the delicate, tinkling notes filled the room, clear and true, like the sound of fairy bells. The mechanism was perfect. The tune ran its course without a fault, and when it ended, Mrs. Dane Covington closed the lid gently and replaced the box on the mantelpiece. For a moment there was silence. Then Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "How perfectly delightful! It quite takes one back to Vienna and the old days." Mrs. Dane Covington resumed her seat. "Yes," she said, her voice low, "it does. That is why I seldom play it now. The memories are still too vivid." There was a slight constraint in the air. Miss Marple, ever sensitive to atmosphere, hastened to change the subject. "What exquisite carving," she remarked. "One sees so few examples of that quality nowadays. Your husband must have had very good taste." Mrs. Dane Covington inclined her head. "He did. He spent a great deal of time abroad on business, and whenever he traveled, he would bring back some small treasure. This music box was one of the last. He was particularly pleased with it, said the mechanism was unusually fine." She paused, then added with a faint smile, "He even joked that it would go on playing long after he was gone." A rather melancholy jest, as it turned out. Mrs. Bantry, always sympathetic, murmured something comforting. The conversation turned to village matters, the forthcoming bazaar in aid of the district nurse, the new curate's promising sermons, the outrageous price of coal. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the music box. She had noticed one small detail. When Mrs. Dane Covington replaced it on the mantelpiece, she had turned a tiny key in the front of the case, locking the lid. It was a precaution, perhaps, against accidental opening by a servant, but it struck Miss Marple as rather deliberate. Tea concluded pleasantly enough. As they took their leave, Mrs. Dane Covington accompanied them to the door herself. "You must come again soon," she said courteously. "It is pleasant to have visitors. One sees so few people nowadays." Mrs. Bantry promised that they would, and the two ladies walked down the drive together in the fading light. "Well," said Mrs. Bantry, as soon as they were out of earshot, "what did you think of her? Rather tragic, isn't she? And that music box, such a charming thing. But I quite understand why she keeps it locked away. Memories can be painful." Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Very painful indeed," she said. "And yet, my dear Dolly, one sometimes wonders whether it is the memory itself that causes pain, or something connected with it." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. "Whatever do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled her gentle, rather deprecating smile. "Nothing at all, I dare say. Only an old woman's fancy. But I have noticed that when people lock things away so carefully, it is not always sentiment that prompts them." They walked on in silence for a few moments, the gravel crunching softly under their feet. Overhead the rooks wheeled and cawed in the tall elms that bordered the drive. Miss Marple's mind, quiet but active, was already turning over small, seemingly unimportant details. The slight tremor in Mrs. Dane Covington's hands, the locked lid of the music box, the faint shadow that had crossed her face when she spoke of her husband's last gift. Trifles, no doubt. And yet, in Miss Marple's long experience, it was often from such trifles that the pattern of human behavior emerged. But for the present she said nothing more. The afternoon was drawing to its close, and the peaceful beauty of Willowbrook seemed untouched by any shadow. The church clock struck 5 as they reached the laurels, and the first lamps were being lit in the cottage windows along the lane. All was serene. And yet, in the quiet depths of Miss Marple's mind, a tiny seed of curiosity had been planted that would, in due course, grow into something far more significant. Chapter 3. The Nighttime Melody. The evening following their visit to the manor passed quietly at the Laurels. Mrs. Bantry, full of her usual high spirits, talked at length over dinner about the forthcoming church bazaar, and the rivalries it had already provoked among the ladies of the parish. Miss Marple listened with her customary gentle attention, contributing an occasional mild comment or reminiscence of similar events in other villages. By 10 o'clock both ladies had retired, and the house settled into silence. Miss Marple was not a heavy sleeper, but neither was she restless. She read for a little while by the shaded bedside lamp a volume of Wordsworth, whose calm verses suited her mood, and then, having said her prayers, turned out the light. The blue room looked towards the back of the house, with a clear view over the garden hedge to the dark mass of the manor beyond. A thin crescent moon hung low in the sky, silvering the edges of the yew trees and throwing long shadows across the lawn. She slept lightly at first, as one does in a strange bed, but towards midnight drifted into a deeper slumber. It was perhaps half an hour later that she woke suddenly and completely, with that peculiar inner certainty that something had disturbed her. For a moment she lay still, listening. The house was perfectly quiet, no creaking boards, no sound of wind in the chimneys. Then, faint but unmistakable, it came again, the delicate, tinkling notes of a music box playing a waltz. Miss Marple sat up in bed and reached for her dressing gown. The melody was "The Blue Danube," the same tune they had heard that afternoon in the manor drawing-room. It floated across the intervening space with extraordinary clarity on the still night air, each note distinct, though softened by distance. She rose quietly and went to the window, drawing back the curtain. The garden lay bathed in faint moonlight. Beyond the hedge the manor stood dark and silent, not a single window lighted. The music continued for perhaps 2 minutes more, running through the waltz once and beginning again, before it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Miss Marple stood there for some time, watching and listening. Nothing moved. No door opened, no figure crossed the lawn. The village clock struck the half-hour 12:30, and then all was stillness again. She returned to bed, but sleep did not come at once. Her mind, orderly and precise, was already turning over what she had heard. A music box does not play of its own accord. Someone must wind it and lift the lid. Therefore, someone had been in the manor drawing-room at midnight, playing Mrs. Dane Covington's treasured possession. But who, and why at such an hour? Mrs. Dane Covington herself, perhaps, overcome by memories, and unable to resist the temptation to hear the tune once more in the solitude of the night. It was possible. Grief took strange forms, and widows sometimes found comfort in secret indulgence of sorrow. Or it might have been one of the servants, a housemaid with romantic notions, stealing down to play the forbidden melody. Young girls were often sentimental about such things. Yet neither explanation quite satisfied Miss Marple. Mrs. Dane Covington had spoken of the box with evident pain, and she had locked it carefully after playing it for her guests. As for the servants, the manor was not a large establishment. There were only 2 maids and the manservant, all of whom had, by Mrs. Bantry's account, been with the family for years, and were unlikely to take such a liberty. And there was the darkness. Whoever had played the music had done so without showing a light. That suggested either great familiarity with the room, or a deliberate wish not to be observed. Miss Marple turned these points over in her mind with the same detached interest she might have given to a new knitting pattern. She had long ago learned that in human affairs, the unusual occurrence was rarely meaningless. A music box playing alone in a darkened house at midnight was certainly unusual. Eventually she slept again, and when she came down to breakfast the next morning, she was her usual serene self. Mrs. Bantry was already at the table, buttering toast with energy. "Good morning, Jane dear. Did you sleep well? I declare I was so tired after all that talking yesterday that I never stirred till 7. Miss Marple poured herself coffee. "I slept quite well, thank you," she said truthfully, "though I did wake once in the night." "Really? Nothing wrong, I hope?" No. Only I thought I heard music very faint. It sounded like the Blue Danube." Mrs. Bantry paused with her toast halfway to her mouth. "Music? At night? How curious. Now that you mention it, I believe I did hear something, though I was half dreaming and took no notice. It must have been Mrs. Dane Covington playing her box. Poor soul, perhaps she couldn't sleep and found comfort in it." "That may be so," agreed Miss Marple mildly. But privately she doubted it. Mrs. Dane Covington had not struck her as the kind of woman who would yield to sentimental impulse in the small hours. There had been restraint in her manner, almost calculation. After breakfast, Mrs. Bantry proposed a walk to the village shops. As they passed along the lane, they met several acquaintances. Miss Hartnell, brisk and managing, on her way to a committee meeting. Young Tommy Pierce, the newspaper boy, whistling cheerfully as he cycled past. And Dr. Haydock, striding along with his medical bag. Mrs. Bantry, never able to resist sharing a morsel of news, stopped to speak to Miss Hartnell. "Did you hear anything odd last night?" she inquired. "Miss Marple and I both thought we heard music from the manor, the Blue Danube, of all things." Miss Hartnell's sharp eyes gleamed. "Indeed I did. I was awake with my neuralgia, and at about 12:30 I distinctly heard it. Very pretty it was, too, though why anyone should play a music box at that hour, I can't imagine. I looked out of my window, but the manor was in complete darkness." They parted, and a little farther on Mrs. Bantry repeated the conversation to the baker's wife, who was sweeping her doorstep. The baker's wife nodded knowingly. "Funny you should say that, ma'am. My husband heard it too when he got up for the baking, said it fair gave him a turn, coming across the fields like that, with no light anywhere." By the time they returned to the Laurels, the incident had become a small topic of village interest. Miss Marple listened quietly to the various comments, noting how each person added some slight embellishment. The music had lasted longer, or sounded louder, or carried an eerie quality in the night stillness. But no one had seen a light in the manor, and no one, it seemed, had mentioned the matter directly to Mrs. Dane Covington herself. Miss Marple reflected that this was typical of village life. News traveled swiftly, but confrontation was avoided. People preferred to speculate in private rather than risk embarrassment. That afternoon, while Mrs. Bantry rested, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room with her knitting. Her needles clicked steadily, but her thoughts were busy. A music box playing alone in the darkness. What did it signify? A harmless whim? Or the first thread in a pattern that might, in time, reveal something far less innocent? She did not know, but she intended to find out. The day drew peacefully to its close. The church clock struck the hours with solemn regularity, and as dusk fell, the lamps were lit in the cottages along the lane. All seemed as tranquil as ever in Willowbrook. Yet in the quiet depths of Miss Marple's mind, a small question persisted, gentle but insistent, like the faint echo of a waltz heard in the night. Chapter 4. Village Whispers. The days that followed the nighttime melody were mild and golden, the sort of autumn weather that makes even the most restless spirit content to linger in a quiet village. Miss Marple settled comfortably into the routine of the Laurels, spent her mornings in the garden with Mrs. Bantry, or taking gentle walks along the lanes, her eyes apparently on the hedgerows and cottage gardens, her mind pleasantly occupied with small observations. Yet the incident of the music box had not been forgotten. In Willowbrook, as in every village Miss Marple had ever known, news, especially unusual news, traveled with remarkable swiftness along invisible channels. By the end of the week, scarcely a soul in the place had not heard that something odd had been going on at the manor. Mrs. Bantry, of course, was a chief conduit. She discussed it freely with her friends over morning coffee, at the Women's Institute meeting, and even with the fishmonger when he called on Friday. Miss Marple, accompanying her on these errands, listened with her usual air of mild interest, saying little but missing nothing. On the Tuesday morning, they stopped at the post office, a small establishment that combined postal services with a modest stock of stationery, sweets, and gossip. Miss Hartnell, who had taken on the duties of postmistress after her mother's retirement, greeted them with bright, inquisitive eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple. Lovely day, isn't it? Though we're promised rain later, they say." Mrs. Bantry handed over her letters to be weighed. "Yes, indeed. By the way, did you happen to hear that music again the night before last?" "I didn't, but Miss Marple thought she caught a strain of it about 1 o'clock. Miss Hartnell leaned forward across the counter, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial pitch. "I did, as a matter of fact. Twice last week, and again on Sunday night. Very clear it was, though faint. The Blue Danube, same as always. I looked out, but the manor was as dark as a tomb. Most peculiar. One wonders if Mrs. Dane Covington walks in her sleep." Miss Marple murmured something deprecating, but Miss Hartnell was not to be discouraged. "I mentioned it to Mrs. Price at the bakery, and she said her husband heard it too, when he was up early for the ovens. And young Tommy Pierce, you know, the boy who delivers papers, told me he's heard it several times on his dawn round. Says it gives him the creeps, coming out of the darkness like that." Mrs. Bantry paid for her stamps and turned to go. "Well, it's very curious, certainly. Perhaps we ought to ask Mrs. Dane Covington herself." Miss Hartnell gave a meaningful sniff. "I shouldn't if I were you. She's very reserved, as you know. Might take it amiss." They emerged into the high street, where the butcher's boy was whistling as he cycled past, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was examining apples at the greengrocer's stall. Mrs. Bantry could not resist stopping. "Good morning, Mrs. Clement. We were just talking about that odd music from the manor. Did you hear it at all?" Mrs. Clement straightened, a mild, rather flustered woman, with pince-nez that perpetually slipped down her nose. "Why, yes, once last Thursday, I think it was. The vicar was asleep, but it woke me. Such a pretty tune, but really, at that hour. I wondered if it could be burglars, but nothing seems to have been taken." By luncheon time, the topic had spread still further. When Dr. Haydock called after surgery to leave a book he had promised Mrs. Bantry, she drew him into the drawing-room and plied him with questions. "You're a man of science, doctor. What do you make of it? Music in the middle of the night. And no light to be seen? Dr. Haydock, a brusque, dark young man with a reassuringly firm manner, shrugged his shoulders. Probably someone in the house unable to sleep. Insomnia is common enough in widows. Or it might be the companion Miss Faraday, isn't it? Nervous type, by the look of her. People do strange things when they can't sleep. But in complete darkness? Persisted Mrs. Bantry. The doctor smiled. If you know a room well, you don't need a light to cross it. Or perhaps they used a shaded candle. Anyway, no harm done, as far as I can see. He took his departure, and Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple. There, you see? A perfectly rational explanation. Miss Marple inclined her head. Very likely, she said placidly. Yet inwardly she was not convinced. Dr. Haydock's explanations were sensible, but they did not quite fit the picture that was forming in her mind. The locked music box, the careful hands of its owner, the complete absence of any light. That afternoon, Mrs. Bantry proposed that they should pay a call on Mrs. Dane Covington, and, as she put it, clear the air. Miss Marple raised no objection, though she suspected the visit would achieve little. They found their hostess in the morning room, a smaller apartment than the drawing room, with French windows opening on to a rose terrace. She received them courteously, though Miss Marple fancied there was a shade of weariness in her manner. Tea was served, and conversation flowed along conventional lines until Mrs. Bantry, with her usual directness, plunged into the subject. My dear, we feel we must mention it. Several people in the village have heard your music box playing at night, quite late, you know. Miss Marple and I heard it ourselves the other night. We wondered if everything was all right. Mrs. Dane Covington set down her cup with a tiny clink. For a moment, her face was perfectly blank. Then she smiled, a little stiffly. How very odd. I assure you I know nothing about it. I have not touched the box since you were here last. I keep it locked, as you saw, on the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Perhaps one of the maids has been curious. Mrs. Bantry hastened to reassure her. Oh no, no one thinks anything of that sort. Only we were a little puzzled, because there was never any light showing. Mrs. Dane Covington raised her eyebrows. No light? Then I fear you must have been mistaken. A music box cannot play itself, and none of us has been wandering about the house in the dark. She spoke with perfect composure, but Miss Marple noticed that her fingers tightened slightly round the handle of her cup. The visit concluded soon afterwards with polite commonplaces. As they walked home, Mrs. Bantry was inclined to be apologetic. Perhaps we shouldn't have mentioned it. She seemed rather put out. Miss Marple agreed mildly that it was sometimes better not to press such matters. But in her own mind, the pattern was growing clearer. Mrs. Dane Covington's surprise had been perfectly enacted, too perfectly, perhaps, and her immediate suggestion that a maid might be responsible rang false. The maids at the manor were middle-aged and respectable, unlikely to risk dismissal for a midnight whim. No, someone had played that music box in the darkness, and done so more than once. Someone who knew the room intimately, who wished not to be seen, and who, most significant of all, had access to the key that locked the lid. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the quiet, nervous companion, Miss Gladys Faraday, whom they had glimpsed only briefly on their previous visit. She was a pale, insignificant woman of about 30, with mouse-colored hair and anxious eyes. Companions, Miss Marple reflected, often knew more of a household's secrets than anyone suspected. That evening, as she sat knitting by the fire, she reviewed the small facts she had gathered. The music had been heard on several nights, always between midnight and 1 o'clock, always without a light, and always the same tune. In villages, gossip flowed freely, but direct inquiry was rare. No one, it seemed, had questioned the servants at the manor, and Mrs. Dane Covington's word had been accepted without demur. Yet Miss Marple knew that acceptance was not the same as truth, and in her long experience, when something inexplicable occurred repeatedly, it was seldom without purpose. She laid down her knitting and gazed into the fire. Somewhere in this quiet village, a small mystery was unfolding, And though it might prove to be nothing more than an oddity, Miss Marple's instinct told her otherwise. Human nature, after all, was very rarely content to leave well alone. Chapter 5. The Burglary That Wasn't. A week passed quietly after the visit to the manor, with no further reports of nocturnal music. The village, having exhausted the topic, turned its attention to more immediate concerns: the arrangements for the Christmas bazaar, an outbreak of whooping cough among the children, and the shocking price of sprouts at the greengrocer's. Miss Marple, knitting steadily in the drawing-room at the Laurels, or taking her gentle walks, appeared to have dismissed the matter entirely. Only the very occasional flicker in her mild blue eyes suggested that it still occupied a corner of her mind. Then, on a raw November morning when the sky hung low and a cold wind swept dead leaves along the lanes, excitement stirred Willowbrook once more. Mrs. Dane Covington had reported a burglary. The news reached the Laurels just after breakfast, brought by the daily woman, Mrs. Archer, who could scarcely contain herself as she laid the table for luncheon. "Burglars at the manor last night, ma'am? The drawing-room window forced, and the police there this morning. Inspector Craven himself, from county headquarters." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Burglars? Good heavens! Was much taken?" Mrs. Archer lowered her voice dramatically. "That's the queer part, now. Nothing at all, by what the cook told my sister-in-law, who works there. Silver left on the sideboard, Mrs. Dane Covington's pearl necklace in her dressing-table drawer upstairs, everything untouched. Only the music box on the mantelpiece was open, though Madame swears she locked it as usual." Miss Marple, buttering a piece of toast, looked up with mild interest. "The music box open? How curious." Mrs. Archer nodded vigorously. "Cook says Madame was quite upset about it, more than about the window, seemingly. Said no one was to touch the box till the police had seen it." By midday, the village buzzed with speculation. Miss Hartnell, encountering Mrs. Bantry outside the post office, declared it was the work of professionals reconnoitering the house for a later visit. Dr. Haydock, calling to see a patient nearby, suggested tramps who had been frightened off. Young Tommy Pierce, delivering newspapers, confided to anyone who would listen that he had seen a suspicious figure lurking near the manor gates 2 nights earlier, though under cross-examination the figure turned out to be the vicar's new curate taking a late stroll. Inspector Craven, a solid, square-faced man with a deliberate manner, spent the morning at the manor. He examined the drawing-room window, which showed clear marks of a jemmy on the sash. He took fingerprints from the sill and the music box. He questioned the entire household. Mrs. Dane Covington received him in the morning-room, pale but composed. She stated that she had retired at 11, as was her custom, and had heard nothing unusual during the night. Miss Faraday, the companion, a thin, nervous woman with a habit of twisting her fingers, confirmed that she, too, had slept soundly. The 2 maids and the manservant all told the same story. The house had been locked up at 10:30, and no one had been disturbed until morning, when the parlor-maid discovered the forced window and the open music box. The box itself stood on the mantelpiece, exactly as Mrs. Dane Covington had described it to her guests. Lid raised, mechanism exposed, but otherwise undamaged. When the inspector wound it experimentally, it played "The Blue Danube" with its usual sweet clarity. "Very odd," said Inspector Craven, closing the lid. "Looks as though the fellow was interrupted before he could take anything. Perhaps he heard a noise and made off." Mrs. Dane Covington inclined her head. "That seems the only explanation, though why he should choose to open the music box, I cannot imagine. It has no great monetary value, only sentimental." The inspector made notes, dusted for prints, finding only smudges, and departed with a promise to investigate further. By afternoon, the story had spread to every cottage. Mrs. Bantry, agog with curiosity, insisted that she and Miss Marple should call at the manor at once to offer sympathy. They found Mrs. Dane Covington in the drawing-room, seated by the fire with Miss Faraday hovering anxiously in the background. The window had been temporarily boarded up, giving the room a slightly sinister appearance. "My dear Mrs. Bantry," said their hostess, rising to greet them, "how kind of you to come. It has been a most unpleasant shock." Mrs. Bantry poured out condolences. "Nothing taken at all? How extraordinary. One hears of these gangs who come prepared and strip a house bare." Mrs. Dane Covington smiled faintly. "Fortunately, this one seems to have been less efficient. The only thing disturbed was the music box. He must have opened it, perhaps expecting to find jewelry inside." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, looked about her with mild interest. Her gaze rested on the mantelpiece, where the box now stood closed once more, and then strayed to the window. The marks of the jemmy were still visible on the white paint of the sash. "Such a disturbing thing to happen," she murmured. "And no one heard anything at all?" "No one," said Mrs. Dane Covington firmly. "We all seem to have slept particularly soundly." Miss Faraday gave a little start. I did wake once, about 2 o'clock, I think. I thought I heard a noise downstairs, but when I listened, there was nothing, so I went to sleep again." The inspector, it appeared, had attached no importance to this. 2 o'clock was rather late for an interrupted burglary, discovered at 8 in the morning. Tea was brought in, and conversation turned to precautions. Better locks, perhaps a dog, the advisability of installing a burglar alarm. Mrs. Dane Covington listened politely, but with an air of detachment. When they took their leave, Mrs. Bantry was full of theories. "Clearly an amateur," she declared as they walked home. "A professional would never have left the silver. And forcing the window so clumsily, anyone might have heard that." Miss Marple agreed that it was all very puzzling. But in her own mind, several small points stood out with clarity. The burglar had entered by the drawing-room window, crossed the room in darkness, ignored the silver on the sideboard only feet away, ignored also the valuable miniatures on the walls, and gone straight to the music box on the mantelpiece. He had unlocked it somehow, possessing or finding the tiny key, and opened the lid, but taken nothing. Then he had left by the same window, without disturbing anything else. It was, as Inspector Craven had said, very odd. And there was another detail. No footprints had been found on the flower bed beneath the window. The earth was soft after recent rain. A man climbing in or out must have left marks. Yet there were none. Miss Marple reflected on these matters as she knitted that evening. A burglary in which nothing was stolen was unusual enough. A burglary concentrated solely on a locked music box of no great intrinsic value was more unusual still. And a burglary with no footprints outside the point of entry suggested something stranger yet. She recalled similar incidents in other places. A supposed theft that concealed some quite different motive. An apparent break-in staged to explain the disappearance of an object that had never left the house at all. But in this case, the music box was still there, undamaged. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Human beings, she reflected, were capable of infinite ingenuity when they wished to deceive. And deception, in her experience, usually left small threads for those who cared to look. The wind rose outside, rattling the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Willowbrook settled for the night, peaceful on the surface, yet with an undercurrent of unease since the events at the manor. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. The pattern was not yet complete, but certain shapes were beginning to emerge. And among them, clearest of all, was the little Swiss music box that seemed to occupy so central a place in the mystery. Chapter 6. The Second Death. 10 days after the supposed burglary, Willowbrook was struck by a tragedy that plunged the village into genuine grief and consternation. It was a cold, foggy morning when the news reached the Laurels. Mrs. Bantry, returning from an early visit to the vicarage, came into the breakfast room pale and shaken. "Jane," she said, sinking into a chair, "the most dreadful thing has happened. Poor Miss Faraday is dead. They found her this morning in her bed. Sleeping tablets, they think." Miss Marple laid down her toast untouched. "Dead?" The companion? Mrs. Bantry nodded. Dr. Haydock was called at once, of course. He says it looks like an overdose. There was a bottle by her bed, almost empty, and a note. Suicide, poor creature. The details emerged gradually through the day, as such details do in a village. Miss Gladys Faraday had seemed in her usual health the previous evening. She had dined with Mrs. Dane Covington, helped her with some correspondence, and retired at about 10:30, saying she felt rather tired. The housemaid who took her early tea at 8 o'clock found her lying peacefully as though asleep, but cold and still. On the bedside table stood a medicine bottle labeled Veronal tablets, 1 or 2 to be taken at night if necessary, prescribed some months earlier by Dr. Haydock for occasional sleeplessness. Only 3 or 4 tablets remained in what had been a nearly full bottle. Beside it lay a single sheet of notepaper on which, in Miss Faraday's neat, rather childish handwriting, were the words, "I cannot go on. Everything is too much for me. Please forgive me." Mrs. Dane Covington, informed by the maid's screams, had been prostrated. She had to be given a sedative and remained in her room under the care of a nurse sent for from the county town. By midday the whole village knew. Miss Hartnell, calling at the Laurels under pretense of borrowing a library book, provided a full account. "Poor woman," she said, settling herself comfortably. One always felt she was the nervous type, always jumping if one spoke suddenly. Companions often are, of course. No real position of their own, independent on someone else's moods. Mrs. Dane Covington could be very exacting. They say Mrs. Bantry murmured sympathy. "And then that burglary," continued Miss Hartnell. "It must have upset her nerves dreadfully. She told cook only yesterday that she hadn't slept properly since." Miss Marple asked gently whether Miss Faraday had seemed depressed lately. Miss Hartnell considered. Not particularly. Rather the opposite, if anything. She was quite cheerful on Monday, told the baker's girl she was looking forward to Christmas. But one never knows with these highly strung people. A sudden fit of despair, and there it is. Dr. Haydock called in the afternoon, ostensibly to inquire after Mrs. Bantry's rheumatism, but really, as everyone understood, to talk about the tragedy. He looked grave. "Sad business," he said. "I blame myself in a way. I prescribed those tablets last spring when she complained of insomnia. But I never imagined she seemed such a sensible woman." Mrs. Bantry asked whether there could be any doubt. The doctor hesitated. The quantity taken was certainly enough to prove fatal, and the note seemed genuine. "Still," he broke off, "there'll have to be an inquest, of course. Tomorrow or the day after." Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly, now spoke. "Was anything else found, Doctor? Any other paper, perhaps?" Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply. "Why do you ask?" "Only that people who decide on such a step sometimes write more than one note explanations, messages to friends." The doctor shook his head. "Nothing of that sort. Only the one note, quite short." He took his leave soon afterwards, and Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend. "Poor man, he feels it deeply. But really, Jane, it seems straightforward enough. The note, the bottle, everything points the same way." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She was recalling the glimpse she had had of Miss Faraday, a colorless, self-effacing woman, but with a certain steadiness in her pale eyes. And she remembered something else, how, during their last call at the manor, Miss Faraday had seemed about to speak, then checked herself when Mrs. Dane Covington entered the room. The inquest was held 2 days later in the village hall. It was well attended. Such events were rare in Willowbrook, and curiosity was natural. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence clearly. Death due to veronal poisoning, the quantity ingested being approximately 30 tablets. The prescription had been for 25, renewed once. Time of death between midnight and 4 a.m. Mrs. Dane Covington, heavily veiled, spoke in a low voice of her companion's recent nervousness, her complaints of sleeplessness, her distress after the burglary. She had noticed nothing unusual on the fatal evening. Miss Faraday had seemed tired but not distressed. The two maids confirmed that everything had been normal. The note was produced and identified as in the deceased's handwriting. The coroner, a kindly elderly solicitor from the neighboring town, summed up sympathetically. There was no evidence of third-party involvement. The note, though brief, expressed clear intent. Verdict: suicide while temporarily of unsound mind. The village accepted the finding without question. Miss Faraday was buried quietly in the churchyard a few days later. Mrs. Dane Covington, still indisposed, did not attend, but sent a large wreath of white lily. Only Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She had sat quietly at the back of the hall during the inquest, her gloved hands folded on her umbrella, her eyes missing nothing. Several small points had struck her as discordant. First, the quantity of tablets. 30 would certainly kill, but it was a large number to swallow voluntarily. People who chose that method usually took enough to ensure sleep from which there would be no awakening 10 or 12, perhaps 15. 30 suggested either blind panic or determination of a very strong kind. Yet Miss Faraday had not seemed a woman of violent emotions. Second, the note. It was too brief, too conventional. Miss Marple had known several cases of suicide. The notes varied enormously, some rambling and emotional, some coldly practical, some full of self-justification. But I cannot go on. Please forgive me, had an odd, almost formal ring, as though copied from a pattern. Third, Miss Faraday's recent cheerfulness. Several witnesses, the baker's girl, the postmistress, had mentioned it casually. People contemplating suicide sometimes experienced a spurious calm. It was true, but more often they showed signs of distress. And there was one other thing. Dr. Haydock's slight hesitation when asked if everything pointed to suicide. He was an honest man. If he had doubts, they were not without foundation. That evening, Miss Marple sat longer than usual by the drawing-room fire. Mrs. Bantry had gone early to bed, pleading a headache brought on by the emotion of the day. Miss Marple's thoughts moved quietly and methodically. Two events now stood out in the recent history of the manor: the strange nocturnal music followed by a burglary, in which nothing was stolen but the music box opened, and now the sudden death of the companion, apparently by her own hand. Were the two connected? Common sense said no. Yet Miss Marple had long ago learned that common sense, useful as it was, sometimes obscured the truth. She recalled the locked music box, the absence of footprints, the concentration of the burglar on that one object. And she recalled Miss Faraday's nervous start when the burglary was mentioned. Companions saw a great deal. They were often in the room when private papers were handled, when telephone conversations took place, when visitors came and went. A clever companion might notice discrepancies, put 2 and 2 together, and if those 2 and 2 made an uncomfortable 4, the companion might become dangerous. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her needles remained idle in her lap. She was beginning to see the faint outline of a pattern, dark and sinister, woven around that innocent-seeming Swiss music box. But proof was another matter, and proof, she suspected, would not be easy to obtain. Outside, the wind moaned in the chimney. The church clock struck 10, then 11. Willowbrook slept peacefully under its blanket of winter fog. But in the quiet drawing-room at the Laurels, an old lady sat thoughtful and wakeful, turning over in her mind the small, apparently disconnected facts that might yet reveal a very wicked truth. Chapter 7. The truth revealed. The fog that had enveloped Willowbrook for several days lifted at last, leaving the air sharp and the sky a clear, pale blue. Miss Marple, who had spent the morning in quiet reflection, asked Mrs. Bantry after luncheon if she might use the telephone to ring Inspector Craven at county headquarters. Mrs. Bantry, surprised but accommodating, showed her to the instrument in the hall. Miss Marple's conversation was brief and conducted in her usual gentle tones. "Inspector Craven? This is Jane Marple speaking. Yes, the same. I wonder if you could spare the time to call here this afternoon. There are one or two small points about poor Miss Faraday's death that I should like to discuss with you. Thank you so much. We shall expect you about 3. She replaced the receiver and returned to the drawing room, where Mrs. Bantry was bursting with curiosity. Jane, whatever do you want with the inspector? You don't mean you think there was something irregular about that poor woman's death? Miss Marple picked up her knitting. I think, my dear, that there has been a very clever murder. And possibly an attempted second one, Mrs. Bantry gasped. Murder, but the inquest? Inquests, said Miss Marple mildly, are only as good as the evidence placed before them. And evidence can sometimes be arranged. Inspector Craven arrived promptly at 3, a burly, dependable figure in his dark overcoat. Mrs. Bantry, at Miss Marple's request, withdrew, leaving the two alone by the fire. Now, Miss Marple, said the inspector, with the respectful but slightly wary manner he reserved for this gentle, dangerous old lady, what is it you wanted to see me about? Miss Marple came straight to the point. I believe, Inspector, that Miss Faraday was murdered, and that the so-called burglary at the manor was staged for the purpose of providing a motive for her supposed suicide. The inspector's eyebrows rose. That's a serious statement. Have you any evidence? Only what I have observed and deduced, replied Miss Marple calmly. But I think it will bear examination. She proceeded to set forth her theory with quiet precision. First, the nocturnal music. Someone in the manor had repeatedly wound and played the music box in complete darkness, at hours when the household was asleep. Mrs. Dane Covington denied all knowledge, yet the box was kept locked. Therefore, someone possessed a duplicate key or access to the original. Second, the burglary. Nothing stolen, no footprints outside the window, yet the music box alone opened. Clearly, not the work of a genuine thief. The object had been to establish the idea of an outside intruder interested specifically in the box. Third, Miss Faraday's death. The overdose, the note, the recent cheerfulness, all inconsistent with voluntary suicide. Companions, Miss Marple pointed out, often knew more of their employer's affairs than anyone suspected. Suppose Miss Faraday had discovered something to Mrs. Dane Covington's disadvantage connected with the music box? What disadvantage? Asked the inspector. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I think, Inspector, that the music box contains something far more valuable than its outward appearance suggests. The late Mr. Dane Covington traveled much abroad. Men who travel abroad sometimes bring back items on which duty has not been paid, jewels, for instance. A music box is an excellent hiding place. The mechanism takes up little room. Beneath it there could be a concealed compartment lined with cotton wool, holding diamonds or other stones worth many thousands of pounds. The inspector looked thoughtful. Possible, certainly. Smuggling is common enough. Go on. Mrs. Dane Covington, I believe, is in financial difficulties. Her husband's death left debts. Those jewels represent a fortune, but she cannot sell them openly without explaining their origin. She needs to establish a story that they have been stolen. Hence the nocturnal music to suggest that a thief is interested in the box, and then the staged burglary. But Miss Faraday discovered the secret, perhaps by accident while cleaning, or perhaps she noticed her employer examining the box in private. She may have threatened exposure, or asked for a share. In any case, she became dangerous. The plan was adjusted. Miss Faraday was drugged perhaps in her evening cocoa, and when unconscious forced to swallow the tablets. The note was forged, or written earlier under some pretext. But to strengthen the suggestion of suicide induced by fear, the burglar was brought into the picture again. On the night of the death, the music box was played once more, at a time when Mrs. Dane Covington could claim to have been awakened by it, gone downstairs, and discovered the body. In fact, she had probably just completed her arrangements. Inspector Craven nodded slowly. It's a theory, certainly. But we need proof. There is proof, said Miss Marple quietly. On the night she died, Miss Faraday, though heavily drugged, retained enough consciousness to realize what was happening. She managed to scribble a message and conceal it. It was overlooked in the first search, because it had slipped partly under the mattress. I suggest you search Miss Faraday's room again, paying particular attention to the bed. You will find a scrap of paper with the words "music box jewels" or something very similar. The inspector stared. How can you possibly know that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because it is what I would have done in her place. And women in great danger often find strength for one last effort. Inspector Craven rose. If this paper exists, it will be enough to justify a warrant. And if the music box does contain concealed jewels. He did not finish the sentence. An hour later, he telephoned from the manor to confirm that a torn half-sheet of notepaper had indeed been found under the mattress. The handwriting, though shaky, was unmistakably Miss Faraday's, and the words read, "Music box jewels tell police." A search warrant was obtained that evening. In the presence of witnesses, the music box was carefully dismantled. Beneath the mechanism, in a cavity lined with faded silk, lay a small collection of uncut diamonds and several fine pearls, property almost certainly smuggled and worth, as later valuation showed, upwards of £20,000. Confronted with the evidence, Mrs. Dane Covington's composure broke. She confessed everything: the smuggling arranged by her husband, her own desperate financial position, the gradual elaboration of the plan to simulate theft, and finally the murder of Miss Faraday when the companion stumbled on the truth and demanded money to keep silent. The nocturnal music had been produced by a simple but ingenious device. A long black thread attached to the winding key passed through a tiny hole drilled in the base of the box and led out through the slightly open drawing-room window to a bush in the garden border. A sharp pull wound the mechanism. Another opened the lid. All could be done from outside, in darkness, leaving no trace. The burglary had been managed similarly, with the jemmy marks made from within. It was all so nearly successful, Mrs. Dane Covington said bitterly. If that old woman hadn't poked her nose in. But Miss Marple, informed later of the full confession, only shook her head gently. Evil is evil, she said, and sooner or later it betrays itself. One small thread, left dangling, is enough to unravel the whole fabric. Willowbrook, relieved and shocked in equal measure, settled back into its usual calm. The manor was shut up pending legal proceedings, and the village talked of nothing else for weeks. But by Christmas, the affair was already becoming legend, and life resumed its peaceful rhythm. Chapter 8. Departure. The morning of Miss Marple's departure dawned bright and frosty, with a pale sun glinting on the rime-covered lawns of Willowbrook. She came down to breakfast a little earlier than usual, her small suitcase already packed and standing in the hall. Mrs. Bantry, still in her dressing gown, insisted on a proper farewell meal kedgeree, deviled kidneys, and quantities of toast and marmalade, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "You've been wonderful, Jane," she said for the 10th time, passing the coffee-pot. "I don't know what we should have done without you. Poor Mrs. Dane Covington, such wickedness, and in our quiet little village. The vicar says it's a judgment, but I say it's a mercy you are here to see through it all." Miss Marple smiled her gentle, deprecating smile. "My dear Dolly, I did very little. One only notices what is already there to be noticed. A thread here, a discrepancy there, and human nature does the rest." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward confidentially. "But tell me truly, how did you first suspect her? Was it the music box from the very beginning?" Miss Marple considered, spreading butter thinly on her toast. "Not from the very beginning, no. At first it was merely curiosity. A music box playing alone in the darkness is unusual, and unusual things are often significant. But it was the burglary that truly aroused my suspicions. A thief who takes nothing, leaves no footprints, and concerns himself only with a locked music box of no great value, such a thief does not exist outside novels of sensation. Then, when poor Miss Faraday died so conveniently, and with that rather too perfect note, I began to see the shape of things. Mrs. Dane Covington needed to be rid of someone who knew too much, and she needed also to strengthen the story of the mysterious intruder. Two birds with one stone, as it were. Mrs. Bantry shook her head wonderingly. And the jewels hidden in the box all the time. 20,000 pounds, they say. Fancy smuggling them like that. Mr. Dane Covington must have been a very unscrupulous man. Unscrupulous, certainly, agreed Miss Marple. And his wife, I fear, was driven by desperation. Debt is a hard master, and pride a cruel one. She could not bear to sell the manor or live modestly. So she chose a darker path. A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Outside, the taxi could be heard drawing up at the gate. Mrs. Bantry accompanied her friend to the door, wrapping her in a warm embrace. You will come again soon, won't you? Willowbrook won't seem the same without you. I should like that very much, said Miss Marple warmly. It has been a most interesting visit. The taxi bore her smoothly along the familiar lanes, past the church with its square tower, past the green where the ducks still waddled importantly, past the cottages with their neat gardens sleeping under the frost. At the station, the porter touched his cap respectfully and took her suitcase. The train was on time, an unusual occurrence that Miss Marple noted with approval. She settled herself in a corner seat facing the engine, arranged her traveling rug over her knees, and took out her knitting. As the train steamed out of Willowbrook, she gazed thoughtfully at the receding village. The manor could just be glimpsed on its slight rise, shuttered and silent now, waiting for new owners who would know nothing of the dark events lately enacted within its gracious walls. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She was thinking of the many villages she had known, each with its own quiet life, its small kindnesses and its hidden cruelties. Human nature, she reflected, was very much the same everywhere, capable of great goodness and great evil, often prompted by the simplest motives: love, fear, greed, pride. In this case, it had been greed, sharpened by fear of poverty. And one woman's cleverness had nearly succeeded in concealing murder beneath a web of ingenious deception. Nearly, but not quite. For evil, however carefully planned, invariably left some small trace. A thread pulled loose, a note too perfectly phrased, a footprint that should have been there but was not. The train gathered speed, and Willowbrook vanished behind a curve. Miss Marple turned her attention to her knitting, a warm scarf in soft blue wool for her nephew Raymond's Christmas present, and her thoughts drifted to the quiet pleasures that awaited her at home: her own garden, her comfortable chair by the fire, the familiar faces of her neighbors. Life would resume its even tenor. There would be parish meetings, the Women's Institute, the occasional visit from friends, and from time to time another small mystery, perhaps no more than a misplaced brooch or an anonymous letter, but one never knew. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a gentle, almost mischievous smile. Villages, after all, were never quite as peaceful as they seemed, and that, she thought contentedly, was what made them so endlessly interesting. The train sped on through the wintry landscape, carrying her back to her own world, where evil had been vanquished once again, and justice, though tardy, had prevailed.